Professor Gavoor. We're going to talk about monopolies today. We're covering monopolies right after we covered perfect competition, and a monopoly is almost the mirror image of a perfectly competitive firm. So we want to talk about how monopolies form, what are the barriers to entry and exit. There's not many to exit, but there's significantly different barriers to entry. How a profit maximizing monopoly chooses at what level of output and price to charge. We'll also look at how in monopolies that have regulatory agencies over them like utilities, where the regulator wants the monopolist to operate in terms of output and price. An early example that they use in the textbook is King Cotton. In the pre-World Civil War era, that was a huge crop and a major export for the U.S. And they had such leverage in Great Britain that imported a lot of cotton from the United States, southern states at that time. The states tried to use that leverage to get the Great Britain to formally recognize the Confederate States. I don't think it really worked because we're still a union. A monopoly, a perfectly competitive firm is when there are many competitors producing a similar good. A monopoly is one firm produces all the output in the market. In a perfectly competitive marketplace, the barriers to entry are relatively easy, or relatively minimal. They're low in cost. In a monopoly, it's much more substantial. A natural monopoly, there's two kinds we're looking at, is where there are barriers to entry or something other than legal prohibition. In legal monopolies, the law prohibits or severely limits competition, and we'll talk a little bit about those last two. So a natural monopoly is an industry in which the marginal cost of adding an additional customer is kind of low compared to the fixed costs of the overall system in place. In that case, think of utilities. They're a natural monopoly in that it would require someone else to, if someone wanted to get into the water, gas, or electricity business, they would have to implement and invest in a huge fixed cost and duplicate a very expensive distribution system. The wires for electricity, the pipelines for natural gas, the pipelines for water in a municipality. In some smaller markets, there might be a monopoly where the products are difficult to transport. You might have one, in times where transportation was more significant an issue than it is now. The roads weren't good. We're basically talking about horse and wagons. Well, most dairy products were, and there was no refrigeration, most dairy products were distributed on a very, very local level, and oftentimes they may have been a monopoly, but they could have also had competition. When a company has control of a scarce physical resource, it's generally acknowledged that in diamonds, De Beers has a natural monopoly because they basically control all of the diamond mines. Now, when we look at why the barriers to entry are so high, we have to look at the long-range average cost curve. If the demand puts us in the bottom of the long-range average cost curve, right here, so the demand curve has to cross this, there will probably be competition. If the demand is low and it's at this startup phase of the long-range average cost curve where the investments in fixed costs are significant, there may be very hard for another company to enter that market, because if they do, the one that has all the business will simply lower their price, and then it becomes a war of attrition to see who caves in first. But usually the monopolist wins when something like that happens. Now, legal monopolies, the government creates barriers to entry by prohibiting or limiting competition. Well, the examples of legal monopolies are the U.S. Postal Service. It is the only entity in the entire nation that theoretically could deliver to each and every address in the country each and every day. And even if there's no mail to be delivered to an address, the truck still drives by it as if there were. It won't, because it probably has mail for the address just before it and address just after it. There's, of course, UPS and FedEx, and now Amazon and DHL compete in this business. But the U.S. Postal Service is subsidized by the government and is basically a legal monopoly for sending letters. Where can you send a letter, even though it's like 55 cents right now? I could write a letter, put it in an envelope, address it to someone. I live in Chicago, to my daughter in Los Angeles, and 2 days later it's there. Well, of course, it's not as meaningful and important now as it was where there was no telephone and no video chatting and none of that. Also, legal monopolies, because of that fixed cost structure that we talked about, are set up for the utilities, electric, water, even garbage collection. Police departments are kind of like a legal monopoly in a city. They're provided by the city. Now, you might say, well, a natural monopoly, the electric, water, and gas companies were also natural monopolies, and they're also legal monopolies. Yes, they're both. They're not exclusive. One could be natural and legal at the same time. Now, how do we protect companies' intellectual property? Oftentimes, some monopolies are created, like Pfizer, in your lifetime has produced 2 drugs for which they basically had a legal monopoly because of copyright. They invented a drug called Lipitor to control cholesterol, and they were the first one to come up with a statin, which is the class of drug to do that. They got a patent. Lipitor was a trademark. They also came up with Viagra. Now, the way the government wants to promote competition is they will give you a monopoly on a drug, on a specific drug, especially and if it's a big hit like Lipitor and Viagra. Well, it meant a lot of money to Pfizer. I mean, they made a lot of money on both drugs, and I think it fueled the financial success of their company over that time. But the government wants to promote innovation, so they don't give you patent on it forever. The patent expires after X number of years. I believe it's 7 or 10 or 12, depending on the kind of product. And then other people can enter the market. So they want to promote innovation. They want to protect people that have done an innovation, but it's not forever. They give you a limited time to recuperate your research and development costs. Likewise, you could have a copyright on music or the written word or art or those kinds of things. That's kind of the equivalent of a patent. The copyrights are hard to enforce in this digital age, but we do take measures to try to do that. If you think of musicians don't make so much money from their recording and the royalties. I mean, they will make some. If it's a mega hit, they will make some money. But most of the time, musicians make their money from touring. A little known fact. And then trade secrets. Well, that's almost like a patent, but it hasn't been patented yet. So if a company is doing research and development and has ideas and ways of doing things that no one else can do, and they are having a hard time copying you or duplicating the same results that you had, they may try to steal your secrets. This corporate espionage happens all the time. A lot of times that's what hacking is all about, especially when it comes to military secrets. So the government tries to protect that to keep the innovation engine going. They encourage innovation through protection of your intellectual property when you develop it, but don't have it last forever, to provide you the incentive to innovate, keep innovating, and to give other people a chance to take part in that marketplace after you've theoretically recouped your R&D costs and made a tidy sum on your innovation. So, intellectual property is a body of law, including patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secret law, that protects inventors to produce and sell their inventions. It implies ownership over an idea or concept or an image or a written word, and not a physical piece of property. Deregulation is removing government controls over setting prices and quantities in certain industries. The trucking industry in the U.S. used to be regulated, as did the airlines. Those are two huge deregulations, I believe, done in the Reagan presidency that increased competition and lowered price and actually improved service for most customers. So in summary, a natural monopoly. Government also often responds with regulation or ownership. And think of water, gas, electric companies. Control of a physical resource. Is there any government role in it? No, but it's De Beers for diamonds. It might be there was not a whole lot of copper companies in the world. So there might have been Calumet and Hecla in the United States. I remember at one point almost had a monopoly on the copper market here. A legal market, a legal monopoly, can be also a water, because most water companies are done by municipalities, the post office, and past regulation of airlines and trucking, even though there was more than one airline and more than one trucking company, but it kind of made a monopoly out of the industry. Patent, trademark, and copyright. Well, is there a government role? Yes, the government grants the patents, the trademarks, and the copyrights, and provides that protection for that intellectual property. And we're talking about new drugs or software, as we talked about Pfizer before. Now, barriers to entry could be intimidating potential customers, competitors. Somewhat, the government has some role in that, but they're supposed to not allow that kind of thing to happen. But it's called predatory pricing by well-known brand names. If you have an upstart little company trying to do something, and you're Kellogg and you're the cereal maker, you could crush them with price reductions until they go out of business. Of course, if someone has a better mousetrap, the probability that they gain some market share is probably still there. So predatory pricing. Firm uses the threat of sharp price cuts to discourage competition. It's a violation of U.S. antitrust law, but it's difficult to prove. And we'll talk about antitrust laws in a following chapter. So, when we said that in a perfectly competitive marketplace, or a firm operating in a perfectly competitive marketplace, they're a price taker. The market sets the price. In a monopoly, the monopolist is a price maker. They can charge any price they want because there's nobody else competing. But there is a demand curve, and the demand curve will give some feedback about how much the consumers of that monopolist's output are willing to purchase at various prices. So the monopolist wants to solve the same problem everybody else does. They want to take P times Q and maximize the revenue if they can, or actually even more so, maximize the profit. So they want to find an operating point that gives them the most money in terms of profits, sometimes in terms of revenue. So there is no supply curve because the monopolist is the supply curve. There's only one competitor. There's no need for a supply curve. There's only a demand curve in monopolies. So when we looked at the perceived demand curve for a perfect competitor and a monopolist, at an instant in time, in a perfectly competitive marketplace, a perfect competitor has a flat demand curve. There's a price. No matter what quantity you make or produce, you sell it at that price. Now that price can change, but we're talking about a snapshot in time. The price could change over time. You start off with a great growing season for some sort of agricultural product, and drought develops later. Your price is going to increase or decrease based on if the conditions for output in that marketplace become higher or lower. And the same thing for a monopolist. Their perceived demand curve is more like a regular demand curve. It has a downward slope. The more they charge, the less quantity people are going to want to buy. If your electric bill tripled, people would be very conservative and wanting to use less electricity. Right now, they don't care about it at all. And this is the point in the course where I make a joke. My grandfather used to wander or walk around the house at night, turning off any light where people weren't in the room. My house, there's lights on all over the place, whether we're in that room or not in that room. But my grandfather would have walked around and turned them all off, all the lights off, muttering under his breath in Armenian, who do these people think? What do these people think? That Edison is our uncle? They're referring to Thomas Edison. That's how, well, my grandfather died in 1974. But he used to do that. And I still smile when I think of him doing that. So we have a demand curve. If they drop the price, the quantity goes up. And you have to look at the elasticity of, the price elasticity of demand to determine where the operating position should be. And we talked about both. So the total cost and total revenue of a monopolist. Total costs rise as output increases. The highest profit will occur at a quantity where total revenue is farthest above total cost, where the gap is bigger. That's the profit is total revenue minus total cost. So when those curves are far apart, farthest apart is where you have the most profit. And why does total cost increase? Because there's one competitor. The one competitor has a fixed capacity of what can be produced. They can produce always a little bit more than that. They can add overtime. They can strain the system. They can forego some preventative maintenance, downtime, and try to eke all they can out of it, but it becomes more costly. The more they do that, the higher the cost to get that little bit more out. If we look at the curve, the total revenue curve is diminishing and the total cost curve is increasing. And you want to find this place where, which approximately 4, I'm guessing, where the difference between total revenue and total cost is the highest. And profits will be, that's basically what we've been saying. So, when we look at the actuality of this, monopolists don't have enough information to analyze its entire total revenue or total cost curve. But the firm does not know exactly what would happen if they were to alter production dramatically. What they do know, they have fairly reliable information about how changing outputs by a small or moderate amounts will affect its marginal revenue and marginal costs. So we're looking at marginal profit, the profit of one more unit of output computed as marginal revenue minus marginal cost. And again, just like in the perfectly competitive firm, we have the marginal revenue, which will be a descending line in most of our problems that we do here, and a marginal cost curve, which is like a U-shaped curve. So the marginal revenue and marginal costs, when those two things cross, that calculus magic occurs, and that's an optimal level of quantity. So when we look at the profit maximizing choice for a monopoly, we're always looking at when marginal revenue equals marginal costs. So marginal revenue decreases as it sells additional units of output. The marginal cost curve is upward sloping. So you want to find that place where they're equal to each other. But that's not where they want to operate, because that says operate at 5 and 500. But that's not the case. If the monopoly produces lower quantity, then marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost at these levels. So if I go down here, marginal revenue is above. If I'm at 4, marginal revenue is above. So if I produce one more, I'm going to get more revenue than I get cost. So yeah, let's do it. But then if the firm is over here, producing one more adds a greater amount of cost and less revenue on the next one. So, and it's below, so your cost is going to increase, your profit will go down. So you don't want to go that way. You want to go, when you're on this side, greater than 5, you want to go to the left. When you're on the left side of 5, you want to increase till you get to this point. So using the same marginal revenue and marginal cost curves, we look at the average cost curve, and we look at the demand curve. So even though marginal revenue, marginal cost cross here, so they want to operate at a quantity of 5, they do not want to operate at 500. They want to operate up here at like 750. So you take the line through where marginal cost, given the quantity where marginal cost and marginal revenue are equal, you want to project through that marginal cost equals marginal revenue point up to the demand curve. And then that will be your price. And that's where monopolists want to operate. That will give them the most profit. And the profit is in the dark shading here. The cost is in the lighter shading. Because remember, it's quantity times dollars. Quantity times dollars. So this is the margin. This is the profit margin. This is the cost. So the lighter shaded box is the quantity on the horizontal axis, and average cost of production on the vertical axis shows the firm's total cost. The darkly shaded box shows the total profits. So since the price charge is above the average cost, the firm is earning positive profits. So here's how you do that. Step 1, the monopolist determines the profit maximizing level of output. The monopolist decides what price to charge by taking that line up from marginal revenue equals marginal cost at that quantity and extends it up vertically through that point to the demand curve and whatever price, and that will be the price that is set for the product. Here's another picture, step 1. So you'll see these kinds of pictures all the time now. You have marginal cost, average cost, you have a demand curve, and you have a marginal revenue curve. And the marginal revenue curve is, if the demand curve is aligned, the marginal revenue curve will be aligned with a steeper slope underneath the demand curve. So we find out where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We want to produce and sell Q1 units of whatever it is we're selling. I take the vertical line through that point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, take it up to this point R on the demand curve and move it over, and that will be the price that the monopolist would want to charge. Where the average cost curve intersects that vertical line, that point P2, this will define the total cost. Between P2 and P1, that will be their margin. the profit margin, and that will be the profit. So it's quantity times P1 minus P2. Revenue is P1 times Q, and total cost is P2 times Q1. So I think we talked our way through all of this. Now, because the market demand curve is conditional, the marginal revenue curve for a monopolist lies beneath the demand curve. When it's linear, the revenue curve will tend to be a parabola. When you have a parabola, your marginal revenue curve, if revenue is a parabola, becomes a straight line with a steeper slope than the demand curve. And it goes negative at some point. And probably this point here where it's 0 is probably the unit elasticity. Okay. So if we looked at this now from another perspective, all right, here's a marginal cost curve on this curve. Here's average cost curve. Here's marginal revenue. Here's demand. So it's the same curve. If I find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost here, we're going to produce a quantity of 4. I follow that line vertically up to point A. And it says we're at 4 and 9.3. So the monopolist wants to produce a quantity of 4, and it could be 4 million as far as we know, at a price of 9.3 per unit. And that's where they're going to get the most profit. Now, antitrust regulators, there's a kind of things they want to look at here. They could say, hey, we're going to break this monopoly up in half. And then the monopoly will operate here instead. Both companies will want to operate here at this point B. So if they split it in half, then each half would produce at point B, and the average cost would be 9.75 and the output of 2. So it would be up slightly higher. Regulators might want to regulate the firm to produce where marginal cost crosses the market demand curve at point C. This is where they'd really like to have it operate. But if it operates here, that's what the regulators would want. That's the best for the consumer. They would want to produce 8 units of production at a cost of and the price would be $3.50 per unit. Well, at this point, we're operating on the right side of marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We will have the firm operating at a loss. So they don't want to do that. Most likely they go to this point F, where the average cost curve crosses the demand curve, and then want to produce at 6 and 6.5. The monopolist wants to produce here. The regulators would want them to operate at one of these 2 points, but most likely this, because they have to allow the monopolist, if in a regulatory environment, to be able to make a profit. Does this apply to De Beers and Diamonds? No, it's not government regulated. De Beers can charge whatever they want. They are, of course, subject to the demand curve. But if I was De Beers, I would try to do exactly this if I had all these numbers. Now, there's another idea when we talk about regulatory agencies controlling monopolies, and it's called regulatory capture. And this is right from Investopedia. So regulatory capture is an economic theory that the regulatory agencies become dominated by the interests they regulate and not necessarily abiding by the public interest. The result is that the agency acts in ways that benefits the industry it's supposed to be regulating. Industries devote large budgets to influencing regulators, while individual citizens spend only limited amount of resources to advocate for their own rights. Companies will put their best people at negotiating with regulators. States aren't necessarily hiring bad people, but they're not hiring the best people money could buy to work on behalf of the citizenry. It seems to work okay, but you have to watch out for regulatory capture. I think this could happen a lot more in poor countries where regulatory capture may be actually accompanied with a bit of bribery under the table. And if someone's only making $40,000 a year and now is making $80,000 a year, that makes a huge difference, and it's a small investment on the part of the regulated monopoly. All right, the inefficiency of monopoly. Well, there's allocative efficiency. We've talked about that. Producing the optimal quantity of some output, the quantity where the marginal benefit to society of one more unit just equals the marginal cost. That's where you want to get. And so you have some inefficiency at some point. I don't know that we ever get to that allocative efficiency point with monopolies. But I'll tell you another thing with monopolies. Without competition, there is a severe risk that monopolies can become grossly inefficient in a way that only competition helps eliminate. And my example is after World War II, many U.S. industries in the United States had virtual global monopolies on what they produced. If you think of General Motors, the largest automotive manufacturer in the world at that point, had 80% of the U.S. market share. Ford had like another 17%. So between the two of them, they had a virtual monopoly on the U.S. industry, and mostly led by General Motors. And they had a lot of worldwide influence in the selling of their vehicles. Basically, everybody that had an automotive infrastructure was blown up by the Allies in World War II. The war never came to the United States. Therefore, our factories remained intact. After the war, we were producing like crazy. Everybody else was trying to rebuild. Well, when you can make everything that you sell, and whether everything you make is really a good product, a good design, or a mediocre one, that takes its toll after a while. So in the auto industry, they were making mediocre products. I mean, I remember in the 60s, there was cars that my current car would fit inside of. I have a truck, so that's not really the case. But if my wife's sedan would fit inside the outer shell of like a Ford LTD or a Chevy Impala or a Cadillac Sedan DeVille. And yet there was less legroom in the rear seat and there was less cubic feet in the trunk. A bag of groceries couldn't even stand up in it. It was really kind of weird. And everything became political. The organizations were bloated with layers of management. I will tell you a story. My first job was at Ford Motor Company in 1976. And I would get an assignment. By the time the assignment got to me, it was a vice president had written a director and had written then the manager who had written a section supervisor who then wrote to me. And each of these writings was what they called a buck slip. And basically all it said, here was a letter from the VP saying, I want to analyze why our windshield wiper warranty costs are going up. I'm a warranty analyst. And windshield wipers are one of the things I was analyzing. Well, he sends it to the director. The director puts a buck slip, which is basically staples a piece of paper, a small 3x5 piece of paper that has his name and title on it, and said to the manager, please handle. The manager would take the letter from the VP with the one buck slip on it, put his own buck slip on it, send it to the section supervisor saying, please handle. The section supervisor would do the same thing to me. Please handle. All right? By the time I got it, it says it's due tomorrow, and it started a week and a half ago. And it just sat in people's inbox for a while because there was no email. Everything was done by paper. I would do the work, and I'd get it done by the due date because, it's obviously a vice president is asking for this, but I would give it to my section supervisor. He would review it with me. And for political purposes, he wanted to see what I was saying before it went to his boss and his boss and his boss. And that happened at each line going up. So by the time the vice president got the report, it was so watered down and politicized that there was almost no information in it. And it was 3 days late. It was completely crazy. Now if you go to Ford Motor Company, after all the competition from the Japanese and now the Koreans and German cars that are taking the marketplace, first of all, General Motors only has 17% of the marketplace. Ford probably still has about 16, 17%. A colossal fall for General Motors. But right now, I would think that 2 or 3 of those layers of management are gone. And there's no more buck slips. Everything's done by email. Assignments are assigned very quickly and tracked, and almost to the point where the vice president could almost answer his own question with the ERP systems they have today. So the monopoly was very inefficient, and people were operating on a political level to try to improve their career rather than to try to promote and excel the value of the company to promote their careers. Because everything that you made, you sold. So that's my little story of the inefficiency of monopolies as well. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you listening. And we're going to talk about monopolistic competition and oligopolies in the next chapter. Thank you.